How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison, Swett, Marden. Chapter 24. Books and Success. Ignorance is the curse of God, knowledge the wing wherewith we fly to heaven. Shakespeare. Prefer knowledge to wealth, for the one is transitory, the other perpetual. Socrates. If a man empties his purse into his head, no man can take it away from him. An investment in knowledge always pays the best interest. Franklin. My early and invincible love of reading I would not exchange for the treasures of India. Gibbon. If the crowns of all the kingdoms of the empire were laid down at my feet in exchange for my books and my love of reading, I would spurn them all. Fénelon. Who of us can tell what he had been had Cadmus never taught the art that fixes into form the thought, had Plato never spoken from his cell, or his high harp blind Homer never strung? Bulwer. When friends grow cold, and the converse of intimates languishes into vapid civility and commonplace, these only continue the unaltered countenance of happier days, and cheer us with that true friendship which never deceived hope nor deserted sorrow. Washington Irving. Do you want to know, asks Robert Collier, how I managed to talk to you in this simple Saxon? I read Bunyan, Crusoe, and Goldsmith when I was a boy, morning, noon, and night. All the rest was task work. These were my delight, with the stories in the Bible, and with Shakespeare, when at last the mighty master came within our doors. The rest were as senna to me. These were like a well of pure water, and this is the first step I seem to have taken of my own free will toward the pulpit. I took to these as I took to milk, and, without the least idea of what I was doing, got the taste for simple words into the very fibre of my nature. There was day school for me until I was 8 years old, and then I had to turn in and work 13 hours a day. From the days when we used to spell out Crusoe and old Bunyan, there had grown up in me a devouring hunger to read books. It made small matter what they were, so they were books. Half a volume of an old encyclopedia came along, the first I'd ever seen. How many times I went through that I cannot even guess. I remember that I read some old reports of the Missionary Society with the greatest delight. There were chapters in them about China and Labrador. Yet I think it is in reading as it is in eating. When the first hunger is over, you begin to be a little critical, and will by no means take to garbage if you are of a wholesome nature. And I remember this because it touches this beautiful valley of the Hudson. I could not go home for the Christmas of 1839, and was feeling very sad about it all, for I was only a boy, and sitting by the fire, an old farmer came in and said, "I noticed thou's fond of reading, so I brought thee summat to read." It was Irving's sketch-book. I had never heard of the work. I went at it, and was as them that dream. No such delight had touched me since the old days of Crusoe. I saw the Hudson and the Catskills, took poor Rip at once into my heart, as everybody has, pitied Ichabod while I laughed at him, thought the old Dutch feast a most admirable thing, and long before I was through, all regret at my lost Christmas had gone down with the wind, and I had found out there are books and books. That vast hunger to read never left me. If there was no candle, I poked my head down to the fire, read while I was eating, blowing the bellows, or walking from one place to another. I could read and walk 4 miles an hour. The world centred in books. There was no thought in my head of any good to come out of it. The good lay in the reading. I had no more idea of being a minister than you elder men, who were boys then in this town, had that I should be here tonight to tell this story. Now, give a boy a passion like this for anything, books or business, painting or farming, mechanism or music, and you give him thereby a lever to lift his world, and a patent of nobility if the thing he does is noble. There were 2 or 3 of my mind about books. We became companions, and gave the roughs a wide berth. The books did their work too about that drink, and fought the devil with a finer fire. In education, says Herbert Spencer, the process of self-development should be encouraged to the fullest extent. Children should be led to make their own investigations and to draw their own inferences. They should be told as little as possible and induced to discover as much as possible. Humanity has progressed solely by self-instruction, and that to achieve the best results each mind must progress somewhat after the same fashion is continually proved by the marked success of self-made men. "My books," said Thomas Hood, "kept me from the ring, the dog-pit, the tavern, and the saloon. The associate of Pope and Addison, the mind accustomed to the noble though silent discourse of Shakespeare and Milton, will hardly seek or put up with low or evil company or slaves." "When I get a little money," said Erasmus, "I buy books, and if any is left, I buy food and clothes." "Hundreds of books read once," says Robertson, "have passed as completely from us as if we had never read them, whereas the discipline of mind got by writing down, not copying, an abstract of a book which is worth the trouble, fixes it on the mind for years, and, besides, enables one to read other books with more attention and more profit." "This habit of reading, I make bold to tell you," says Trollope, "is your pass to the greatest, the purest, and the most perfect pleasures that God has prepared for his creatures. Other pleasures may be more ecstatic, but the habit of reading is the only enjoyment I know in which there is no alloy." The Bible was begun in the desert in Arabia ages before Homer sang and flourished in Asia Minor. Millions of books have since gone into oblivion. Empires have risen and fallen. Revolutions have swept over and changed the earth. It has always been subject to criticism and obloquy. Mighty men have sought its overthrow. Works of Greek poets who catered to men's depraved tastes have, in spite of everything, perished. The Bible is a book of religion, and can be tried by no other standard. "Read Plutarch," said Emerson, "and the world is a proud place, peopled with men of positive quality, with heroes and demigods standing around us who will not let us sleep." "There is no business, no avocation whatever," says Wittenbach, "which will not permit a man who has an inclination to give a little time every day to the studies of his youth." "All the sport in the park," said Lady Jane Grey, "is but a shadow of that pleasure I find in Plato." "In the lap of eternity," said Heinsius, "among so many divine souls, I take my seat with so lofty a spirit and such sweet content, that I pity all the great ones and rich men that have not this happiness." "Death itself divides not the wise," says Bulwer. "Thou meetest Plato when thine eyes moisten over the Phaedo. May Homer live with all men forever." "When a man reads," says President Porter, "he should put himself into the most intimate intercourse with his author, so that all his energies of apprehension, judgment, and feeling may be occupied with and aroused by what his author furnishes, whatever it may be. If repetition or review will aid him in this, as it often will, let him not disdain or neglect frequent reviews. If the use of the pen, in brief or full notes, in catchwords or other symbols, will aid him, let him not shrink from the drudgery of the pen and the commonplace book." "Reading is to the mind," says Addison, "what exercise is to the body. As by the one health is preserved, strengthened, and invigorated, by the other virtue, which is the health of the mind, is kept alive, cherished, and confirmed." "There is a world of science necessary in choosing books," said Bulwer. "I have known some people in great sorrow fly to a novel, or the last light book in fashion. One might as well take a rose draught for the plague. Light reading does not do when the heart is really heavy. I am told that Goethe, when he lost his son, took to study a science that was new to him. Ah, Goethe was a physician who knew what he was about. "When I served, when a young man, in India," said a distinguished English soldier and diplomatist, "when it was the turning point in my life, when it was a mere chance whether I should become a mere card-playing, hookah-smoking lounger, I was fortunately quartered for 2 years in the neighbourhood of an excellent library, which was made accessible to me. Books, says E. P. Whipple, are lighthouses erected in the great sea of time. As a rule, said Benjamin Disraeli, the most successful man in life is the man who has the best information. You get into society in the widest sense, says Geikie, in a great library, with the huge advantage of needing no introductions and not dreading repulses. From that great crowd you can choose what companions you please, for in the silent levees of the immortals there is no pride, but the highest is at the service of the lowest, with a grand humility. You may speak freely with any without a thought of your inferiority, for books are perfectly well bred and hurt no one's feelings by any discriminations. Sir William Waller observed, "In my study I am sure to converse with none but wise men, but abroad it is impossible for me to avoid the society of fools." It is the glorious prerogative of the empire of knowledge, says Webster, that what it gains it never loses. On the contrary, it increases by the multiple of its own power. All its ends become means, all its attainments help to new conquests. At this hour, 500 years since their creation, says De Quincey, the tales of Chaucer, never equalled on this earth for their tenderness and for life of picturesqueness, are read familiarly by many in the charming language of their natal day, and by others in the modernization of Dryden, of Pope and Wordsworth. At this hour, 1,800 years since their creation, the pagan tales of Ovid, never equalled on this earth for the gaiety of their movement and the capricious graces of their narrative, are read by all Christendom. There is no past so long as books shall live, says Lytton. No wonder Cicero said that he would part with all he was worth so he might live and die among his books, says Geikie. No wonder Petrarch was among them to the last and was found dead in their company. It seems natural that Bede should have died dictating, and that Leibniz should have died with a book in his hand, and Lord Clarendon at his desk. Buckle's last words, "My poor book," tell a passion that forgot death, and it seemed only a fitting farewell when the tears stole down the manly cheeks of Scott as they wheeled him into his library when he had come back to Abbotsford to die. Southey, white-haired, a living shadow, sitting stroking and kissing the books he could no longer open or read, is altogether pathetic. No entertainment is so cheap as reading, says Mary Wortley Montague, nor any pleasure so lasting. Good books elevate the character, purify the taste, take the attractiveness out of low pleasures, and lift us upon a higher plane of thinking and living. It is not easy to be mean directly after reading a noble and inspiring book. The conversation of a man who reads for improvement or pleasure will be flavored by his reading, but it will not be about his reading. Perhaps no other thing has such power to lift the poor out of his poverty, the wretched out of his misery, to make the burden-bearer forget his burden, the sick his sufferings, the sorrower his grief, the downtrodden his degradation, as books. They are friends to the lonely, companions to the deserted, joy to the joyless, hope to the hopeless, good cheer to the disheartened, a helper to the helpless. They bring light into darkness and sunshine into shadow. 25 years ago, when I was a boy, said Rev. J. A. James, a schoolfellow gave me an infamous book which he lent me for only 15 minutes. At the end of that time it was returned to him, but that book has haunted me like a spectre ever since. I have asked God on my knees to obliterate that book from my mind, but I believe that I shall carry down with me to the grave the spiritual damage I received during those 15 minutes. Did Homer and Plato and Socrates and Virgil ever dream that their words would echo through the ages and aid in shaping men's lives in the 19th century? They were mere infants when on earth in comparison with the mighty influence and power they now yield. Every life on the American continent has in some degree been influenced by them. Christ, when on earth, never exerted 1/1,000,000th part of the influence he wields today. While he reigns supreme in few human hearts, he touches all more or less, the atheist as well as the saint. On the other hand, who shall say how many crimes were committed the past year by wicked men buried long ago? Their books, their pictures, their terrible examples live in all they reach and incite to evil deeds. How important, then, is the selection of books which are to become a part of your being. Knowledge cannot be stolen from us. It cannot be bought or sold. We may be poor, and the sheriff may come and sell our furniture, or drive away our cow, or take our pet lamb, and leave us homeless and penniless. But he cannot lay the law's hand upon the jewelry of our minds. Good books and the wild woods are two things with which man can never become too familiar, says George W. Cable. The friendship of trees is a sort of self-love and is very wholesome. All intimate nature is but a mirror, and it is greater far to have the sense of beauty than it is to be only its insensible depository. The books that inspire imagination, whether in truth or fiction, that elevate the thoughts, are the right kind to read. Our emotions are simply the vibrations of our soul. The moment fiction becomes mendacious, it is bad, for it induces us to believe a lie. Fiction, purely as fiction, must be innocent and beautiful, and its beauty must be more than skin deep. Every field of art is a playground, and we are extra pleased when the artist makes that field a gymnasium also. Cotton Mather's Essay to do Good, read by the boy Franklin, influenced the latter's whole life. He advised everybody to read with a pen in hand and to make notes of all they read. James T. Fields visited Jesse Pomeroy, the boy murderer, in jail. Pomeroy told him he had been a great reader of blood and thunder stories, that he'd read 60 dime novels about scalping and other blood performances, and he thought there was no doubt that these books had put the horrible thoughts into his mind which led to his murderous acts. Many a boy has gone to sea and become a rover for life under the influence of Marryat's novels. Abbott's Life of Napoleon, read at the age of 7 years, sent one boy whom I knew to the army before he was 14. Many a man has committed crime from the leavening, multiplying influence of a bad book read when a boy. The chaplain of Newgate Prison in London, in one of his annual reports to the Lord Mayor, referring to many fine-looking lads of respectable parentage in the city prison, said that he discovered that all these boys without exception had been in the habit of reading those cheap periodicals which were published for the alleged amusement of youth of both sexes. There is not a police court or a prison in this country where similar cases could not be found. One can hardly measure the moral ruin that has been caused in this generation by the influence of bad books. In the parlour window of the old mossy vicarage where Coleridge spent his dreamy childhood lay a well-thumbed copy of that volume of Oriental fancy, the Arabian Nights, and he has told us with what mingled desire and apprehension he was wont to look at the precious book, until the morning sunshine had touched and illuminated it, when, seizing it hastily, he would carry it off in triumph to some leafy nook in the vicarage garden, and plunge delightedly into its maze of marvels and enchantments. Beecher said that Ruskin's works taught him the secret of seeing, and that no man could ever again be quite the same man or look at the world in the same way after reading him. Samuel Drew said, "Locke's essay on the understanding awakened me from stupor, and induced me to form a resolution to abandon the grovelling views I had been accustomed to maintain." An English tenor, whose leather gained a great reputation, said he should not have made it so good if he had not read Carlyle. The lives of Washington and Henry Clay, which Lincoln borrowed from neighbors in the wilderness, and devoured by the light of the cabin fire, inspired his life. In his early manhood he read Paine's Age of Reason and Volney's Ruins, which so influenced his mind that he wrote an essay to prove the unreliability of the Bible. These two books nearly unbalanced his moral character, but fortunately The books which fell into his hands in after years corrected this evil influence. The trend of many a life for good or ill, for success or failure, has been determined by a single book. The books which we read early in life are those which influence us most. When Garfield was working for a neighbor, he read Sinbad the Sailor and the Pirate's Own Book. These books revealed a new world to him, and his mother with difficulty kept him from going to sea. He was fascinated with the sea life which these books pictured to his young imagination. The Voyages of Captain Cook led William Carey to go on a mission to the heathen. The Imitation of Christ and Taylor's Holy Living and Dying determined the character of John Wesley. Shakespeare and the Bible, said John Sharp, made me Archbishop of York. The Vicar of Wakefield awakened the poetical genius in Goethe. I have been the bosom friend of Leander and Romeo, said Lowell. I seem to go behind Shakespeare and to get my intelligence at first hand. Sometimes in my sorrow a line from Spenser steals in upon my memory as if by some vitality and external volition of its own, like a blast from the distant trump of a knight pricking toward the court of Faery, and I am straightway lifted out of that sadness and shadow into the sunshine of a previous and long-agone experience. Who gets more enjoyment out of eating, asks Amos R. Wells, the pampered millionaire whose tongue is the wearied host of myriads of sugary, creamy, spicy guests, or the little daughter of the labourer, trotting about all the morning with helpful steps, who has come a long 2 miles with her father's dinner to eat it with him from a tin pail? And who gets the more pleasure out of reading, the satiated fiction glutton, her brain crammed with disordered fragments of countless scenes of adventure, love and tragedy, impatient of the same old situations, the familiar characters, the stale plots? She, or the girl who is fired with a love for history, say, who wants to know all about the grand old, queer old Socrates, and then about his friends, and then about the times in which he lived, and then about the way in which they all lived, then about the Socratic legacy to the ages? Why will that girl ever be done with the feast? Can you not see, looking down on her joy with a blessing, the very lord of the banquet, who has ordered all history and ordained that the truth he fashions shall be stranger always than the fiction man contrives? Take the word of a man who has made full trial of both. Solid reading is as much more interesting and attractive than frivolous reading, as solid living is more recreative than frivolous living. I solemnly declare, said Sydney Smith, that but for the love of knowledge I should consider the life of the meanest hedger and ditcher as preferable to that of the greatest and richest man in existence, for the fire of our minds is like the fires which the Persians burn in the mountains. It flames night and day, and is immortal, and not to be quenched. Upon something it must act and feed, upon the pure spirit of knowledge, or upon the foul dregs of polluting passions. Therefore, when I say in conducting your understanding, love knowledge with a great love, with a vehement love, with a love coeval with life, what do I say but love innocence, love virtue, love purity of conduct, love that which, if you are rich and great, will vindicate the blind fortune which has made you so, and make men call it justice. Love that which, if you are poor, will render your poverty respectable, and make the proudest feel it unjust to laugh at the meanness of your fortunes. Love that which will comfort you, adorn you, and never quit you, which will open to you the kingdom of thought, and all the boundless regions of conception, as an asylum against the cruelty, the injustice, and the pain that may be your lot in the world. That which will make your motives habitually great and honourable, and light up in an instant 1,000 noble disdains at the very thought of meanness and of fraud. Do I feel like hearing an eloquent sermon? Spurgeon and Beecher, Whitefield, Hall, Collier, Phillips Brooks, Canon Farrer, Dr. Parker, Talmage are all standing on my bookcase, waiting to give me their greatest efforts at a moment's notice. Do I feel indisposed and need a little recreation? This afternoon I will take a trip across the Atlantic, flying against the wind and over breakers without fear of seasickness on the ocean greyhounds. I will inspect the world-renowned Liverpool docks, take a run up to Harden, Call on Mr. Gladstone. Fly over to London and take a run through the British Museum and see the wonderful collection from all nations. Go through the National Art Gallery, through the Houses of Parliament, visit Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace, call upon Queen Victoria, the Prince of Wales. Take a run through the Lake region and call upon the great writers, visit Oxford and Cambridge, cross the English Channel, stop at Rouen, where Joan of Arc was burned to death by the English. Take a flying trip to Paris, visit the tomb of Napoleon, the Louvre Gallery. Take a peep at one of the greatest pieces of sculpture in existence, the Venus de Milo, which a rich and ignorant person offered to buy if they would give him a fresh one. Take a glance at some of the greatest paintings in existence along the miles of galleries. Take a peep into the Grand Opera House, the grandest in the world, to make room for which 427 buildings were demolished. Promenade through the Champs-Élysées, pass under the triumphal arch of Napoleon, take a run out to Versailles and inspect the famous palace of Louis XIV, upon which he spent perhaps $100 million. Do I desire to hear eloquent speeches? Through my books I can enter the Parliament and listen to the thrilling oratory of Disraeli, of Gladstone, of Bright, of O'Connor. They will admit me to the floor of the Senate, where I can hear the matchless oratory of a Webster, of a Clay, of a Calhoun, of a Sumner, of Everett, of Wilson. They will pass me into the Roman Forum, where I can hear Cicero, or the rostrums of Greece, where I may listen spellbound to the magic oratory of a Demosthenes. No matter how poor I am, says Channing, no matter though the prosperous of my own time will not enter my obscure dwelling, if the sacred writers will enter and take up their abode under my roof, if Milton will cross my threshold to sing to me of paradise, and Shakespeare to open to me the worlds of imagination and the workings of the human heart, and Franklin to enrich me with his practical wisdom, I shall not pine for the want of intellectual companionship, and I may become a cultivated man, though excluded from what is called the best society in the place where I live. With the dead there is no rivalry, says Macaulay. In the dead there is no change. Plato is never sullen. Cervantes is never petulant. Demosthenes never comes unseasonably. Dante never stays too long. No difference of political opinion can alienate Cicero. No heresy can excite the horror of Bossuet. Heed not the idle assertion that literary pursuits will disqualify you for the active business of life, says Alexander H. Everett. Reject it as a mere imagination, inconsistent with principle, unsupported by experience. The habit of reading may become morbid. There is a novel-reading disease. There are people who are almost as much tied to their novels as an intemperate man is tied to his bottle. The more of these novels they read, the weaker their minds become. They remember nothing, they read for the stimulus. Their reasoning powers become weaker and weaker, their memory more treacherous. The mind is ruined for healthy intellectual food. They have no taste for history or biography or anything but cheap, trashy, sensational novels. The passive reception of other men's thoughts is not education. Beware of intellectual dram drinking and intellectual dissipation. It is emasculating. Beware of the book which does not make you determined to go and do something and be something in the world. The great difference between the American graduate and the graduates from the English universities is that the latter have not read many books superficially, but a few books well. The American graduate has a smattering of many books, but has not become master of any. The same is largely true of readers in general. They want to know a little of everything. They want to read all the latest publications, good, bad, and indifferent, if it is only new. As a rule, our people want light reading, something to read that will take up the attention, kill time on the railroad or at home. As a rule, English people read more substantial books, older books, books which have established their right to exist. They are not so eager for recent publications. Joseph Cook advises youth to always make notes of their reading. Mr. Cook uses the margins of his books for his notes, and marks all of his own books very freely, so that every volume in his library becomes a notebook. He advises all young men and young women to keep commonplace books. We cannot too heartily recommend this habit of taking notes. It is a great aid to memory, and it helps wonderfully to locate or to find for future use what we have read. It helps to assimilate and make our own whatever we read. The habit of taking notes of lectures and sermons is an excellent one. One of the greatest aids to education is the habit of writing out an analysis or a skeleton of a book or article after we've read it, also of a sermon or a lecture. This habit has made many a strong, vigorous thinker and writer. In this connection we cannot too strongly recommend the habit of saving clippings from our readings wherever possible of everything which would be likely to assist us in the future. These scrapbooks, indexed, often become of untold advantage, especially if in the line of our work. Much of what we call genius in great men comes from these notebooks and scrapbooks. How many poor boys and girls who thought they had no chance in life have been started upon noble careers by the grand books of Smiles, Todd, Matthews, Munger, Whipple, Geikie, Thayer, and others. You should bring your mind to the reading of a book or to the study of any subject as you take an axe to the grindstone, not for what you get from the stone, but for the sharpening of the axe. While it is true that the facts learned from books are worth more than the dust from the stone, even in much greater ratio is the mind more valuable than the axe. Bacon says, "Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested." That is, some books are to be read only in parts, others to be read but not curiously, and some few to be read wholly and with diligence and attention. Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. And therefore, if a man write little, he had need have a great memory; if he confer little, he had need have a present wit; and if he read little, he had need have much cunning to seem to know that he doth not. Histories make men wise, poets witty, the mathematics subtle, natural philosophy deep, morals grave, logic and rhetoric able to contend. Chapter 24.